All right, everyone, welcome to our dialogue number 18 in this cycle called Reimaginar lo Humano, something like reimagining the human, something like that. And today we have the pleasure of having a stellar guest, which is my friend Steve Hickman, directly from California. Are you in San Francisco, Steve?
No, I'm actually in Oregon.
In Oregon, so not in California. Okay, sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I used to be in San Diego, but not now.
Thank you for being here with us, Steve. It's an honor and a pleasure to talk with you for this hour.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So Steve Hickman has been working in the field of mindfulness and self-compassion for a long time. Probably at least a few decades. We're going to explore more of your story soon. He's a clinical psychologist. He's a teacher and trainer in the program of mindful self-compassion, although before that he was already teaching mindfulness and the program MBSR for quite a long time too. He's associate professor of clinical psychology in the School of Medicine at the University of California in San Diego, and he was the founding director of the Center for Mindfulness at UC San Diego. He has worked closely with the founders of the Mindful Self-Compassion program, Chris Germer and Christine Neff, and he designed, along with Michelle Becker, the teacher training program for mindful self-compassion. And he's been traveling all over the planet to teach others teach that program. He has trained over 1,000 mindful self-compassion teachers. Additionally, he has been teaching mindfulness for a long time, and he has written recently a new book called Self-Compassion for Dummies, which is a practical and very accessible guide to really practice self-compassion in a very direct and simple way. So welcome, Steve, and thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Yes, if you can guide us in a brief practice, we tend to open this space, practicing a little bit, so we are in your hands.
All right. Well, let's just take a little time to actually allow ourselves to arrive in this moment together for this meeting. I would just invite you to perhaps turn your attention inward, maybe soften your gaze or allow your eyes to close, and simply tune in to this body as it is just now in this moment. You might be aware of sensations in the body, sensations of the support of the earth underneath, or the chair or cushion that you're on. May be aware of the sensations of coolness or warmth, the touch of clothing, maybe internal sensations of relaxation or tension, discomfort, ease. Perhaps you're aware of this body breathing in this moment, without having to breathe in any particular way, simply allowing the breath to breathe itself. And if you'd like, I'd invite you to place a hand on the body, perhaps on the chest or some other place that feels for you to be soothing and supportive. to feel the kindness and warmth of your own touch. Just reminding ourselves that we're actually here. Feeling the physical presence of our own hand on our own body, giving ourselves the gift of warmth and support, encouragement, kindness. And you can leave your hand here or place it somewhere else or just let it rest in your lap, knowing that we can always return to reminders of this one here that is worthy of our own kind attention. Letting attention rest now on breathing, each breath, breath after breath. Noticing how the breath nourishes the body on the in-breath and cleanses or relaxes the body on the out-breath. Breath after breath. Allowing yourself to feel the gentle rhythm of breathing. In-breath and out-breath. Noting how the breath tends to the body without our awareness in each breath, nourishing the body, cleansing the body. And allowing ourselves to flow gently on the surface of breathing like a little boat on the water. As the breath moves in and out like the tide, like the waves on the ocean. And each time that you notice the mind has wandered or drifted, just bringing it back firmly but warmly, like a little lost puppy. Over here, over here. No place else to go and nothing else to do. And as you're ready, letting go of this particular practice, just taking a few moments to ease back into this conversation, into the room with all of the others. Whenever you're ready, allowing eyes to open, maybe moving the body however it needs to move. Perhaps it needs a little stretch, a little twist. Just listening to what this body needs and giving it what it needs. Thank you. Thank you for your practice.
Thank you, Steve, for getting this beautiful short practice to get us started. In my experience, starting with a little bit of practice really allow us to settle in and connect with the intention that brought us all here. And I'm happy that we have such a nice group here, 160 people joining us for this conversation. And I'd like to start a little bit with your own story. You've been swimming in the waters of self-compassion for quite a while, but I'd like to bring you to the moment when you first learned about self-compassion. What did you understand and did not understand of what this was all about? Why were you drawn to this work on self-compassion? And which benefits do you see in yourself of navigating these waters?
Wow, a lot in that question. Yes, so I would start by saying that I first came to self-compassion as a skeptic. I was skeptical of the need for self-compassion, and so maybe I was a bit like some of you may be today. I was teaching mindfulness-based stress reduction. I had been teaching it for a while. I was training teachers of it. And I had this sense that it was all in mindfulness, that compassion was just a part of mindfulness, and that I was really questioning whether there needed to be a different program to teach people to be self-compassionate. I thought I was always teaching compassion when I was teaching mindfulness, which I believe I was actually. But to make a long story short, I had an invitation from my dear friend and colleague, Michelle Becker, who had taken the training in mindful self-compassion, had taken the course from Chris Germer and Kristen Neff, and came back to our center at UC San Diego. And she was the first person they invited to teach the program other than herself. And they told her they would like her to teach it, and they would really like her to teach it with someone who was already teaching mindfulness, that the program was intended to be taught by two people, and nobody else was trained to teach the program. And so they asked her, who do you know who teaches mindfulness that you'd like to teach self-compassion with? And she also knows that I have a difficult time saying no to any requests. And so when she asked me to co-teach with her, I said, well, okay, I'm not convinced we need a program like this, but I'll give it a try. And I went into teaching it before ever being trained to teach it, which is not a good way to become a teacher. I don't recommend it, but it was all that was available because there was no teacher training back then. But I began to teach, and this is when my eyes were opened to Gonzalo's question about what convinced me of the importance of self-compassion. There were a number of people who took our MSc course who had taken MBSR from me, and I knew that they had gotten something valuable from learning mindfulness. But then something different happened for them in the MSc course. They seemed to kind of warm up, to kind of melt or bloom in a certain way. They spoke more, they laughed more, they cried more. Something special happened for them in there that hadn't necessarily happened for them in mindfulness. And in talking with them, what I learned was I have nothing against teaching mindfulness at all, but for them, they not only learned to be more present with their own activities of their mind, the thoughts and emotions that came up during mindfulness training, but now with self-compassion, they had a way to meet themselves when those things that came up were really difficult, aside from just staying present, being with the emotions. They could be with themselves and could answer this really fundamental question that is the fundamental question of self-compassion. That question is, what do I need? What do I truly need in this moment? And so much happened for them that was what turned the tide for me, that convinced me there was something in this. Having continued to teach mindful self-compassion and seeing the transformations that happen for people when they learn how to be with themselves in the midst of difficulty, how to treat themselves kindly rather than harshly or with a lot of judgment and shame, and to see how people transform, that has me hooked.
Mm-hmm. 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 Did you suffer from self-criticism yourself? Did it make an impact in you to enter in contact with these practices?
That's a good question. We teach in the Mindful Self-Compassion program, we teach about having an inner critic and how to work with that inner critical voice. And it's somewhat ironic that I personally don't really have that. But
Mm-hmm.
what I have learned is that I have a sneakier version of the inner critic, a very clever, I call it a trickster or a seductress. And it's a voice that undermines me when I want to make a change. And it doesn't do it by criticizing me. It sort of seduces me into not changing. And that's a whole big topic by itself. But I've learned that while I don't have that harsh inner critic, that self-criticism, I'm still subject to being, or was subject to being ruled by difficult emotions and overruled by difficult emotions, anger, frustration, sadness, anxiety from time to time. And self-compassion gave me the capacity to be less subject to those difficult emotions, getting carried away, getting reactive, going onto autopilot.
Mm-hmm. That's great. When you said this, it's going to bring to mind that we humans tend to be shaped emotionally by our early experiences, many of us, and the cultures that we grow up. And we're going to talk a little bit more about masculinity later, but what I've seen is that there are some emotions that we tend to go to, like some of us go to anger, some others go to sadness, or some others to anxiety. And I often find that it's hard for many of us to relate to the whole spectrums of our emotions. So what would you say is the relationship between working on self-compassion, developing self-compassion, and relating to one's diversity of emotions?
Well, I think this is one of the reasons why self-compassion seems to be a sort of universally accepted and sought after. I know that somebody asked you a question when they signed up to attend here about different cultural differences with self-compassion. And my experience, having taught self-compassion in Asia, in Europe, in South America, in North America, no matter where I've gone, I've taught in Azerbaijan, I've taught in Chile, I've taught in Bali, I've taught in China. Somehow or other, it seems to resonate for everyone, regardless of their cultural situation. And I think part of that is because self-compassion is a way of relating to any difficult emotion. So even if the predominance of emotions in one culture may be somewhat different, maybe shame is a bigger part of some cultures than others. Anger might be more of a different, might appear more often in other cultures, etc. That we can meet any of these emotions with self-compassion. And remember that emotions themselves, in and of themselves, are not bad things. They may be difficult, they may be painful, but they are expressions that usually have a reasonable source of some sort. Sometimes they're very intense, more intense than they need to be for the situation, or more intense than is helpful. So when we're practicing self-compassion is not eliminating emotions, even the difficult ones. It's learning to have a different relationship with those emotions so they don't overrule us, so that they don't cause us more problems. So self-compassion allows us to meet fear before it turns into anxiety or panic, or it allows us to meet sadness and just acknowledge that sadness is here without it escalating into depression, for example.
Mm.
So I think it's sort of universally adaptable, so to speak, in that sense, is that we learn to cultivate a different relationship with any of these visitors to our guest house, so to speak.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm. And if it's something that it's universally applicable, and I guess nobody would debate that self-compassion is linked to well-being and it's something that we would like to develop, then why do you think it's hard for so many people to find self-compassion?
Uh,
There's an open mic. Traten de mantener los micrófonos cerrados, por favor. So I was asking, why is it hard to connect with self-compassion? Why do you think people tend to be so self-critical and hard to find this space of self-support in the face of difficulty?
yeah, it's a big question. It's an important question. But when we talk about self-compassion, we talk about it having three components, and it's helpful to think about it this way and how that's related to why it's so hard. So Kristen Neff's research has also shown that there are essentially these three components of self-compassion. There's mindfulness. So there's the actual being aware of the presence of struggle or suffering in the moment. Okay, we can't do anything with a difficult emotion if we aren't aware that we're actually having it. So mindfulness is the first component. The second component is what we call common humanity, that we're all human. We all share the same DNA, largely. We all share the same kind of fears and anxieties. We are all imperfect. We all make mistakes. We all have failures. We all fall short sometimes. So recognizing that is the second piece. And then the third piece is kindness. So in other words, once we're aware of suffering, recognizing that it's a common trait of humans, then can we give ourselves what we need in the moment? And that's the kindness. Can we give ourselves kindness? So if we think about the way that we have evolved as humans, when we are born, we need to be loved, right? We are not self-sufficient when we come out of our mother's womb. We need parents or caregivers to provide for us so that we can survive. So we need love.
Mm.
So that might just mean love in the form of food, clothing, and shelter. Very tangible things, but these are the things that we need. And so our very survival depends upon that. And so we often fear the loss of love or the absence of love. And so that means that we may become less mindful and worry and ruminate over all the ways in which things won't go our way. We might think about all of the possible scenarios that could happen to us. Okay, so that's when we are the opposite of mindful. We're also afraid that we're all alone, that we're not connected. That's a great evolutionary fear, that we're not be connected to our caregivers, right? We were physically connected to our mothers, right, before we were born, and that same kind of connection is needed for us to survive. And so we fear the disconnection. We fear that we're not sharing a human bond. And so we feel isolated even when we are sharing the common humanity. And we also want to find a way to get the love that we need. So what often happens, just to oversimplify just a little bit, is that many times we have been raised, not to blame our parents, but to say that we have been raised in such a way that in order to get what we need, love has been somewhat conditional.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I will love you if you do this thing, or I will love you if you get good grades, or I will love you if you behave perfectly in some way. So we often, out of the best of intentions. So one great example is I like to think of a parent who really wants the best for their child. They really want their child to succeed in the world, to have everything that they want. And in their minds, the way for their child to do that is to get perfect grades, to do everything to the max, to get the highest marks in the class, to win every race. And so, because they figure that's the path to success. But what they accidentally do is to send a message to that child that they need to be perfect. And if they're perfect, they'll get everything they want, including love. And so we end up with a lot of perfectionists in the world who were trained by parents who meant well, but basically set ridiculously high standards and left us as perfectionists, as thinking, I'm not lovable unless I am perfect.
Mm.
And the problem with that is that humans are not perfect. So it's an impossible task, but we still keep trying. And as long as we're trying to be perfect, as long as we're running from shame, of fear of being disconnected, practicing self-compassion seems like the worst thing we could do. Not trying to be perfect, giving up on being perfect, that sounds like the path away from love.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only by
Very
sort of
tough.
diving in that we can actually realize that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. So you would say that perfectionism and in growing with the idea that love is not available unless I meet certain standards, it's something that we tend to internalize, that I won't accept myself unless I'm successful or I meet certain criteria.
Right. And that's one path. I mean, there's also the path where, a parent, is just harsh and critical. And then the child sort of takes that criticism in and begins to believe it. So think about this. Sorry to extend the question a little bit, but if your life depends upon a parent who is providing you food, clothing, and shelter, and you're 4 years old, and they tell you you're a terrible person, you're stupid, you're ugly, there's something wrong with you, whatever it is, you are not in a position to dispute that from your parent, because that parent is where you get life from. And so quite often what happens is it's easier, it preserves your existence to go along with your parent, to say, oh, you're right, I am a bad person. Because when you agree with them, you get what you need. You get taken care of, you get their attention. It's a very unhealthy way of doing it, but you do it for your own survival. You take the side of the abusive or hurtful care provider in order to preserve your life. And then that just gets embedded in you as you grow older.
Yeah. So let's bring to mind that case. Let's say that there's somebody that has really difficult feelings toward themselves, like self-hatred, for instance, not just being perfectionist, not just trying to strive for the best, but really a feeling of being inadequate, being ashamed of oneself, being constantly self-criticizing, and maybe having grown up in an environment where they have to be submissive and trying to appease an angry father, for instance. Have you seen those kind of people in the courses, how do they do with these practices? Because as you mentioned, it can be challenging to start doing something so new, like treating yourself well. So what have you seen in these kind of cases where the self-critical is more intense and there is some sort feeling of self-hatred in the person?
Yeah, I think this is a great example. I'm glad that you brought it up, because in those really difficult situations growing up, what ends up happening is you've formed kind of an unwritten contract with that care provider who's maybe very judgmental and harsh. And if you've made a deal with the devil, so to speak, to preserve your life. And so if you start to practice self-compassion, it can feel like you're breaking that bond. And it can feel almost life-threatening, even if it really isn't logically so. It can feel like you're saying that up is down and black is white. It can be very difficult. And so this is why when we teach the mindful self-compassion program, we very often remind people that it's okay to go slow. That it's okay to be a slow learner, so to speak, to only go as far as you're willing to go, and to ease into this, we can use the language of medicine and say, titrate your dose. Only open up to as much struggle and suffering as you feel you can manage, and take your time through it. And another thing that often happens for people in a situation like you described, Gonzalo, is that over the years, a person who's been criticized, mistreated, abused, verbally abused in particular, has figured out how to survive, kind of telling themselves they didn't need compassion. Just the need for compassion was just put away, just stored away somewhere in order to get through a really difficult situation. You almost might think of it as like hot coals that are thrown into a furnace and the furnace door is shut. So every time that, you got injured and you went to your father for comfort, for compassion, and you got the opposite, you put another hot coal in the furnace and closed the door. You needed compassion, you didn't get it, so you just figured out how to get by. So if you think about that, over a lifetime or over many years of growing up, that's a lot of fire in the furnace that you've stored up, right? And so when I invite you, as I did in this meditation, to put your hand on your heart and to give yourself just a little bit of kindness. Often for people, that can feel as if someone just swung that furnace wide open and all that heat came out at once. So sometimes an act of self-compassion, or when someone is compassionate toward you, might actually feel bad at first, because you might have this phenomenon that we call backdraft. It's just a matter of that you've opened that furnace too fast, too wide open, when your heart has not been used to receiving the compassion that it desperately needed. So if for you or for anyone that you might share compassion, self-compassion with, if at first you or they encounter a difficult feeling, anger, irritation, fear, whatever, something other than warmth and kindness, that's a sign that you're giving yourself just what you need, but you probably need to lower the dose at first. You need to go slow. You need to open that furnace just a little bit to let a little of the heat out, and then you close it again. And then next time you can do it a little bit more. But the idea is that if you give yourself compassion and what you get in return is something other than what you expect, it's probably backdraft, and it's probably because you're giving yourself what you need, and it's just going to take a little time. So be patient with yourself.
That's very good. In terms of in compassion focused therapy, we have this idea that we have to go slow in exposing patients to the warmth of the therapist or the practices themselves, because these practices stimulate the attachment systems. And when we touch the attachment systems of people, that everything that is there will come up, and not always is beautiful or simple. So paradoxically, it seems that it's not rare that people sometimes practice compassion and get an activation of the threat system. They feel threatened by the warmth, in many cases because those who had to provide warmth and care and safeness were abusive or neglectful.
Exactly. Yeah, and one other aspect to this too is that as human beings, some other thing that we all share is the capacity to open and close to our emotions, to our experiences. You know this, so we have the capacity control, or to titrate our dose, so to speak, if we actually listen, right? So we can begin to learn how to open and close our hearts to this practice. Maybe it's opening it just a little bit, because if we take too much, it's just too much for us to manage. It's like adjusting the water temperature to just the right temperature. And as when we do that, when we listen to our bodies, like often what will happen is maybe you're someone who really tries hard to get things, to kind of conquer self-compassion, and you push yourself and you practice and you do some self-compassion practice, and all this backdraft comes up and you just, grit your teeth and push through it. Well, you're not practicing self-compassion when you do that. If you decide, oh, I need to close, this is just a little too much for me, I need to ease up, I need to even take a break from this, you're giving yourself what you need. You're practicing self-compassion by closing. So we can notice when we're ready, when we're inclined and open. We can notice when we're not ready and we're not inclined, or we don't have the capacity, and gently close. And in either case, it's still self-compassion. So in the Mindful Self-Compassion program, we give people opportunities to check in, to say, wow, am I ready for this exercise, or am I closing? Do I feel that I'm getting sleepy, that my attention is drifting, that I'm resisting or something? Maybe I need to close and not do this practice, or just follow my breath. And the good news is you're still practicing self-compassion, even when you're not doing the exercise or the meditation. If you've listened to your body and your heart and responded to it, responded to what you needed.
So just to let know people that are here in the group, I'm taking some of the questions that you all sent for this interview, and I'm interweaving them with our conversation with Steve. And so something that people were curious about was, well, what if my self-critic is right? And I find that a very good question, because sometimes we can feel, well, if I'm self-compassionate, I will be focusing on soothing my difficult feelings, maybe not challenge myself in ways that can frustrate me potentially. But what if my self-critic is an ally that is helping me to achieve some things that could bring a big sense of satisfaction if I get to do them? What happens if I'm so self-compassionate that I don't get anything accomplished that is of value in my life? What would you say to that?
So there are a number of kind of common misgivings about self-compassion. And I think you just named about 4 or 5 of them in what you just said, where we think that self-compassion could be self-indulgence. It's just giving ourselves whatever we need, whenever we want it, that it makes us soft, that it makes us lose our edge, that maybe it undermines our motivation to succeed. And there are some others, but a couple of things. First of all, there's a fair amount of research that points in the other direction. So about losing your edge, for example, that maybe you need your inner critic to drive you to succeed, to push, and to do better and do better. Well, I like to think of the inner critic as like the worst kind of inner coach, like a sports coach, the soccer coach, who just berates all the players, yells at them, beats them, throws things at them, tells them they're worthless. So that approach kind of works for a while, and sometimes there are successful coaches. But really the best coaches, as we know, are the ones who can really motivate people from a different place, not of criticism, but out of desire to succeed. And so what we understand is that a very self-critical person can push themselves and may do quite well, say in sports as one example. But the real problem isn't that, but when that person fails, or falls short, loses the race, loses the job, whatever it is, they're terrible to themselves. They beat themselves up so that that person who's self-critical becomes less and less inclined to try harder, because when they try and fall short, it's horrible, it's painful. And so often the people who succeed, people who are more self-compassionate, tend to try harder, longer, and succeed because they can tolerate it when they fail, when they fall short, because they're not so self-critical. So the same is true about self-indulgence. We actually understand that people will take better care of themselves when they're self-compassionate. They'll actually eat better, change some of their difficult behaviors like smoking or overeating or other kinds of things when they're self-compassionate, because they care about themselves in the long term. And I just wanted to touch on that the first thing that you said in terms of what if my inner critic is right? So there may be times when the inner critic tells us, oh, you know what, you're not very good at this, or you're kind of slow at getting these things or understanding certain things. So that's different than saying you're stupid, or you're ugly, or you're lazy, or whatever it is. So the inner critic that we're talking about is that critical voice, that evaluative voice that doesn't necessarily have your best interests at heart, and is just often like the internalized voice of someone who said that to you when you were younger. Now, can you have high standards and be self-compassionate? Of course. You can actually say, I need to work harder at this, like understanding these kinds of concepts means I have to try hard, but I know I can do it and I'm going to give it my best effort. And that's where we can use what we see as our weaknesses. We can learn to address them mindfully rather than reactively. So the last thing to say about an inner critic, if you look really closely at your inner critic, if anybody here has an inner critical voice, I'm sure at least 75% of you do. And if you don't, you have that see, there's some hands already. So here's an interesting thing to do. Take a look at that inner critic. Nobody wants to hear that critical voice. It's painful, it's hurtful. It maybe reminds you of someone earlier in your life. But if you look at the motive of that inner critic, it's trying to help you. And what I mean by that is it's trying to spare you difficulty. So if it tells you, oh, you would never get that promotion at work, you're not smart enough. It's basically trying to say, don't try for that job because you might be disappointed. See, it's like being a very terrible parent. It's essentially sparing you from hurt by protecting you, by telling you, don't try that. Don't push yourself because then it might hurt, you might fail. So look at your inner critic. We have a whole exercise in the MSc program for working with that inner critic. But if you want to play around a little bit with your inner critic, see if you can figure out a way that it's trying to help you, even if it's doing a terrible job. Because then you can start to see, oh, okay, yeah, thanks, inner critic. Yeah, you're trying to help me, but I have other plans. I appreciate your efforts, but this isn't working for me. This is a way of starting to change your relationship with that inner critic. Again, because just like the difficult emotions, self-compassion isn't about getting rid of your inner critic. It's about seeing what your inner critic is trying to do and then letting it go. Letting your own voice come through rather than the critic's voice.
So what you're saying is that maybe the intention is not bad, but the strategy is awful. So we need to change the strategy and keep in the.
Yeah.
Steve, well, the time is going so fast, but I want to really ask you a little bit about a problem that I have, which is I've been more or less teaching these things for about 10 years or 15 years now, quite intensively, mainly mindfulness, emotional regulation, and compassion, and self-compassion in the context of compassion training. And I see that the most difficult people are men. I see the world and I see who are destroying the planet, mostly men, who are starting economic crisis, mostly men, who are about to push the nuclear buttons, is usually men. And then they don't come too much to compassion training or self-compassion training or even mindfulness training. If you see the group that we have here, although I promoted this talk as we are going to talk a little bit about masculinity and what it means to me a compassionate man, it's mostly women again. So I love to spend time, with women because I think they have the interest and the sensitivity, and I think many of the positive changes that we are seeing are coming from women. But still, I'm concerned that the most troubled people are not getting the message or the tools or the practices. So how do you deal with this? I guess you have had some same experience. What's going on with us men that we are not getting the message or not even getting interested?
Well, I think first we should celebrate those men who are here. So thumbs up to all of you who showed up. Thank you for being willing to be in the minority alongside so many well-meaning women. It's a big topic. And I think at the most obvious level, when you say self-compassion, to most people, at least I think those of us in the West and maybe everywhere, it sounds very soft. At first impression, it sounds kind of stereotypically feminine to say self-compassion because people think of it as self-pity or as being soft on yourself, self-indulgent or weak in some way. And so that's a problem right off the bat for men because we're raised a different way in the West in particular, where all of those things are not part of supposedly who we're supposed to be. So it's an easy sell to women who have struggled with being kind to themselves, or maybe always, women are often raised to be carers for others, to be, maternal and caring, and to be self-sacrificing and to take care of other people first. And so it's very obvious that self-compassion is missing in their lives. And it's hard for me to talk about how it is for women, but I think for men, a lot of the messages we get as boys is to not have emotions, that emotions are somehow bad, they're to be avoided, they're to be pushed away. I don't know how it is in Latin America, but I know
here in North America, big boys don't cry, and all kinds of unkind things that we say to boys to tell them to man up, to various things that give us the message that we're not supposed to have emotions, that emotions are for girls, and that we should just be tough. We should push through, and emotions are a problem. So, and compassion, again, to men, compassion sounds soft and weak. But actually, when you get a little bit closer, and this is where is our challenge for how to make sure that the world knows this, the world of men knows this, is that compassion and self-compassion is very strong. It's actually very closely tied to resilience and strength. But we often think of, self-compassion has both a yin and a yang side, a sort of fierce and a tender side. And most of us think of the tender side, the comforting, the soothing, the nurturing side of self-compassion, being able to bring warmth and kindness to ourselves when we struggle. But the other side of self-compassion is the one that especially men could benefit from, is about protecting ourselves, providing for ourselves, motivating ourselves. These are all very strong, active components of self-compassion. And the challenge is that people, men in particular, don't see that side of it. If we say, oh, I'm teaching mindful self-compassion, they don't necessarily see that side of things. So when you talk about protecting, like, that's a very stereotypically masculine thing, to be protective, right? So protecting ourselves, saying no to things, is a very self-compassionate act, even though it's firm and it's active. So this is also really beneficial, of course, for women as well. But providing for ourselves, giving ourselves what we need, seeking out what we need, is also a part of self-compassion, and also something that men are inclined to do. And motivating ourselves, as I said, the motivation, the more self-compassionate we are, the harder we try, the longer we try, the more likely we are to succeed at making a change. So I think the challenge is that these messages collide with how many men are raised. We're sort of supposed to figure out how to get by without emotions. That's the message that we get. And so anything that involves emotions is like foreign or weak or something, and it goes, it's a real challenge. But really, this is why I think the more that we think about the fact that self-compassion is really, at its heart, is about learning to be fully present with whatever arises inside of us, and to be informed by it without being ruled by it. And little by little, if we can send that message, then if you look at the worst behavior, and you made reference to it, we have this terrible epidemic of shootings in this country, in the US right now, and they're virtually all men. And if you look at any one of those men, you could say that that man basically was experiencing incredibly strong emotions of some sort, fear, shame, doubt, whatever, and didn't know any other means to deal with that emotion than to take a gun and go and shoot some people. And it doesn't excuse the behavior, but it says we have an epidemic of men who have never learned how to deal with their own emotions, to confront and have emotions.
Yeah.
So it's a big subject for sure.
I mean, men without emotional skills and an overabundance of guns is not a very good combination.
That's a bad combination. A recipe for disaster.
Republicans in Congress, that's another factor.
Yeah, don't get me started on that topic.
Yeah, we're not going to that rabbit hole. So from what you say, I'm sensing that men are having trouble accessing self-compassion because they have trouble being vulnerable. There's something scary about being vulnerable and connect with their emotions. We're afraid of vulnerability. And on the other hand, maybe it's the case that women have a little bit more problem, not with being sensitive or vulnerable, but to express assertive anger, like the more young side of compassion. What do you think about that?
Yeah, because especially that what you just said, in terms of it's not okay in a lot of societies for women to be angry. It's just inappropriate for whatever reason. That's the message that's received. And sometimes anger is appropriate for certain situations. If you're being harmed, standing up for yourself and saying no or protecting yourself is a huge act of self-compassion. But if you've been socialized to not access that emotion of anger, to not stand up for yourself, it puts you in a very vulnerable place. So that goes across genders in so many ways. One of the things that I've learned, because I've done some workshops with just men and teaching self-compassion, is that when you start to get men together and they feel safe enough, that's a big challenge, is to create a safe container, which I think mindful self-compassion and other mindfulness courses do. And they start to talk, they start to realize the common humanity, because this is another factor, is there's a lot of loneliness in our world, a lot of isolation. We're super connected. Look, 161 of us can get together from all over the planet, but we're all in our individual places. And in many ways, we're very disconnected from each other. We feel very lonely and separate. We feel like we're uniquely sad, uniquely bad, uniquely flawed in some ways. And that leads to the opposite of the common humanity. So my point is that when we've brought men together and they've been able to share the challenges that they've faced of being bullied or having been the bully, of struggling with emotions, with anger, getting in trouble for anger and things like that, we start to realize it's not just one of us, it's each of us, and that there's strength. There's a sense that we share the challenges and that we can also do things differently. And there's some hope in that when I've seen men learn self-compassion, it didn't make them weak. It didn't make them feminine. It didn't make them self-indulgent. It actually made them stronger, more diverse, more complex, more connected. And it's just a hard message to send. It's hard to get that across. So we need to work hard, and our female colleagues can go a long way towards inviting men into their courses, into their therapies, by being sure that you're inclusive. I mean, we spend a lot of time, especially here in the US, about being inclusive of different identities and ethnicities, etc. It is worthwhile for women. I try to tell our teachers of mindful self-compassion that are women, you need to think in terms of inclusivity and diversity in terms of the men in your classes, that the language of self-compassion doesn't have to be feminine, it doesn't have to be overly soft and sweet. It can be strong, it can be firm. It doesn't have to feel motherly necessarily. So there are a lot of things that you can do that invite men into the conversation and makes them feel welcome. And it's worth the time and effort.
So let's say that somebody that is in that position, like it's just getting interested in maybe changing his ways, or maybe some women here in the group have a partner that shows this pattern of being over-identified with the tough or protective or like not vulnerable, like what would you say could be the first few steps to get into a more self-compassionate framework or more compassionate framework in general? What can people do?
That's a challenge for sure. And I have met a few men who were dragged to mindful self-compassion by their female partners. That usually hasn't really gone very well. So brute force is maybe not the best choice. I think validating emotions, there's something in validating emotions, and what I mean by that is that talking with men about their emotions. Men are not really programmed to talk about emotions, but they do have them. And so making room for them and making them okay, so that I think there isn't a lot you can do directly. As I'm talking, I'm thinking the best teacher of self-compassion is to be self-compassionate. And that means that as a partner for someone who you think could use more self-compassion, practice self-compassion yourself. Meet your own difficult emotions with kindness and warmth and curiosity. Give yourself what you need. You're a role model. And when you're embodying that practice, it invariably rubs off on the people around you. There's a whole theory or idea that we have these mirror neurons in our brains that allows us to feel the feelings of other people. That's a whole topic for another time. But we are interconnected as humans. We do feel each other's presence. And when we can feel our partners becoming more self-compassionate, we will be more inclined to do that as well. So really, I think the best advice is to practice self-compassion. And that's what we tell teachers of self-compassion. They need to practice. They need to be, we call it a loving, connected presence. So loving is the kindness, connected is the common humanity, and presence is the mindfulness. This is the best way to convince someone else to become more self-compassionate is to practice it yourself around them.
That's beautiful. When we train people in the therapists in compassion focused therapy, a message that I want to get across, that something very valuable that we can offer to our patients is a self-compassionate presence of the therapist as a model of self-compassion. And I think that can maybe respond another question that somebody sent, which was a very beautiful one. It was a male, a father, that said, how can we change this transgenerational pattern of not being self-compassionate to my kids? How can I transfer that to the next generation? And I think you're saying just practice yourself and they will learn from what they see.
Exactly. That's how we all learned, right? Is from our own caregivers. And it's not easy. Parenting is the toughest job in the world, right? But if we can be authentically loving, connected presences with our children, mothers and fathers, we really send a different message. We actually can make a change in the way our children grow up and in the messages they get and how they become adults and how they act as adults. It's not as fast as you'd like. It takes generations, but that's the best way. I mean, our children are like sponges. They soak up everything they see and hear. And so when we can practice it, they'll pick it up.
Steve, we are reaching the end of our time. maybe I'd like to ask you if you would leave a message to these people and for those who are watching this in YouTube in the future, what would you like to leave resonating in people's minds and bodies about this whole thing?
I think self-compassion is more than just an internal process that can change your life, that can make you more effective, more resilient, more responsive. Self-compassion can actually change the world. And what I mean by that is that because this capacity to meet our difficult emotions with presence, with kindness, to give ourselves what we need in moments of suffering, actually empowers us so that we can do the things that need to be done. And so when we see things in the world, or when we see injustice that's done against us or others, when we see things in the world that we don't like, that we think are wrong or bad, we've made reference to a couple of them today, self-compassion gives us strength. It gives us the resolve to notice the emotions and not just waste them, but actually respond to them. Because if if injustice makes you angry, if it makes you feel helpless, if it makes you feel hopeless or discouraged, that's because justice matters to you. And so if you remember that, seeing injustice and having it upset you means that justice matters, then you can take action around justice. Rather than giving up because of injustice, you can say, what can I do in favor of justice? What can I do to make a change in my world? Whatever it is, whether it's voting, whether it's going to a protest, whether it's signing a petition, making a donation, any kind of action. Self-compassion actually allows us to be more effective. So don't think of this as a solitary practice that you can just do in the privacy of your own home for your own heart. Self-compassion can make a difference in the world, and the world needs more self-compassion. It definitely needs more compassion with all of the things that we face.
Compassion, self-compassion can make a difference in the world. Thank you.
Absolutely.
For leaving that note resonating. Thank you very much, Steve, for this conversation. The time flew with you and so many important ideas that you share in this time. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
I want to also highlight just for a moment my friend Manu. So she's in the screen too. Please translate this, Manu. Thank you, Manu, for do it. Thank you, Manu, for being the voice in Spanish for some of our guests. People should know that everything in this encounter is free. People are donating their time. Steve is donating his time. Manuela has been very hard to convince to accept not getting paid. She's been doing it for free. So thank you, Manu, for your time and for your talent. And I think I'm going to unhighlight us so we can see the whole group. People can open their mics if they want to say bye.
Gracias.
Muy bien.
Muchas gracias. Thank you
Gracias
so
a
much.
todos.
Gracias
Gracias, hermoso.
Gracias.
Gracias, salud.
Thank you, Steve.
Hermoso,
Thank you so
gracias.
much.
Gracias.
Bueno,
Adiós. Que estén muy
hermoso.
bien.
Gracias, igualmente.
Todo el amor. Muchas gracias.